The stench was so overwhelming that even the most hardened courtiers at Versailles struggled not to vomit in the presence of their king. What you'll discover about Louis XIV's final months will challenge everything you thought you knew about the most powerful monarch in European history. The year was 1614, and the glittering halls of Versailles echoed with the whispered prayers of desperate physicians and the muffled sobs of terrified servants. But on this August morning of 1715, a different sound would soon fill the air. The grotesque symphony of a living god slowly decomposing while still drawing breath. This wasn't merely the death of a king. It was the systematic destruction of the most elaborate royal persona ever constructed, a carefully orchestrated descent from divine majesty to putrid mortality that would haunt the French court for generations. The popular imagination has sanitized Louis XIV's final days into a dignified royal death, but the reality was far more sinister and infinitely more horrifying. Today, we strip away the myth of the Sun King and examine the unflinching reality of how absolute power corrupts not just the soul, but the very flesh that contains it. When Louis XIV ascended to the throne in 1643 at the tender age of 4, France beheld what appeared to be a child blessed by God himself. Contemporary portraits reveal a boy of almost angelic beauty, with golden curls cascading over his shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold the promise of divine greatness. Court chroniclers described the young king as possessing an otherworldly grace, moving through the marble corridors of his palaces like a creature born to rule over lesser mortals. His physical presence commanded absolute reverence from the moment he could walk, and by his teens, Louis had transformed into what many considered the most magnificent specimen of European royalty ever produced. The young Sun King stood nearly 6 feet tall, an imposing height for his era, with a perfectly proportioned athletic frame that spoke of divine favor and royal breeding. His face, framed by elaborate wigs that became his signature, was a masterpiece of classical proportion, with high cheekbones, piercing dark eyes, and lips that could shift from benevolent smile to imperious command with devastating effect. Foreign ambassadors wrote breathlessly to their sovereigns about Louis's overwhelming physical presence, describing how even hardened diplomats found themselves trembling in the face of such concentrated majesty. This was not merely a king, they reported, but a living embodiment of royal power that seemed to radiate light itself. But even as Louis basked in universal adoration, the seeds of his eventual horror were already being planted deep within his psyche and his flesh. The elaborate court rituals of Versailles, designed to reinforce his divine status, had created a man who existed in complete isolation from human reality. Every morning began with the lever, an elaborate ceremony where dozens of nobles competed for the privilege of handing him his shirt or watching him eat his breakfast. Every evening concluded with the coucher, another ritualized performance where the king's most intimate bodily functions became matters of state protocol. This systematic dehumanization, disguised as worship, had twisted Louis's understanding of his own mortality in ways that would prove catastrophic as his body began its inevitable decline. The first ominous signs appeared when Louis reached his 40s, though the elaborate machinery of court propaganda worked tirelessly to conceal any evidence of royal weakness. Palace physicians noted increasing complaints of digestive distress, leg pain, and recurring fevers, but these symptoms were carefully attributed to the king's vigorous hunting schedule and his legendary sexual appetite. Contemporary accounts suggest Louis was consuming enormous quantities of rich foods daily, often eating meals that would feed entire peasant families while courtiers watched in reverent silence. His physicians, terrified of suggesting that their divine sovereign might possess the same physical vulnerabilities as common mortals, prescribed increasingly exotic remedies that only accelerated his bodily deterioration. By the dawn of the 18th century, Those privileged few who were permitted close proximity to the Sun King began to notice disturbing changes in his appearance and behavior. The magnificent physique that had once symbolized French power was gradually expanding into grotesque obesity, with Louis's legendary appetite transforming from royal indulgence into compulsive gluttony that seemed to consume him from within. Court records indicate he was now requiring mechanical assistance to rise from his chairs, and his famous dancing, once the highlight of Versailles entertainments, had ceased entirely as his legs could no longer support his increasing bulk with anything approaching grace or dignity. More troubling was the gradual transformation of Louis's legendary charm into something far more sinister and unpredictable. The king, who had once captivated Europe with his wit and sophistication, was becoming increasingly prone to explosive rages followed by periods of confused melancholy that left his courtiers walking on eggshells. His famous quote about being the state had evolved from confident assertion into megalomaniacal obsession, with Louis apparently losing the ability to distinguish between his own physical needs and the requirements of governing France. Palace servants whispered of finding the king talking to mirrors for hours, practicing speeches to audiences that existed only in his increasingly disordered mind. The year 1709 marked the beginning of Louis's visible physical collapse, though the elaborate protocols of Versailles ensured that news of the king's declining health remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in Europe. Court physicians documented a series of alarming symptoms that suggested multiple organ failure, including severe swelling in his legs and abdomen, recurring infections that refused to heal, and a persistent fever that left him alternating between violent chills and profuse sweating. Most disturbing of all was the gradual change in his skin color, which began taking on an increasingly yellow hue that spoke of liver failure and metabolic collapse. The king's legendary appetite, once seen as evidence of his superhuman vitality, had transformed into something grotesque and compulsive that horrified even his most devoted servants. Louis was now consuming massive quantities of food at each meal, often eating until he vomited, then immediately resuming his feast as if nothing had happened. Palace kitchens worked around the clock to satisfy his increasingly bizarre cravings, which ranged from entire roasted peacocks consumed in single sittings to elaborate desserts that required teams of confectioners to prepare. Yet despite this constant consumption, the king's body was clearly wasting away beneath layers of bloated flesh, suggesting that his digestive system was no longer capable of processing nutrients properly. Even more disturbing was Louis's growing obsession with his own bodily functions, a fixation that represented a grotesque inversion of the elaborate toilet rituals that had once symbolized his divine status. The king began demanding detailed daily reports on the consistency and color of his excrement, treating these biological processes as matters of state importance that required careful documentation and analysis. His physicians, trapped between their medical knowledge and their terror of contradicting royal will, were forced to participate in increasingly elaborate examinations of the king's waste products, searching for omens and portents in substances that would have been considered beneath notice in any rational medical context. The transformation of Versailles itself reflected the king's deteriorating condition, as the once magnificent palace gradually took on the oppressive atmosphere of an elaborate tomb. The famous Hall of Mirrors, where Louis had once dazzled foreign ambassadors with displays of French power and culture, now served primarily as a showcase for the king's physical decline, its countless reflective surfaces multiplying images of bloated flesh and sickly yellow skin into infinity. Court ceremonies that had once celebrated royal majesty now resembled religious rituals designed to maintain the illusion of divine health, with elaborate protocols ensuring that only the most carefully chosen courtiers were permitted to witness the king's physical deterioration. By 1713, even the most elaborate court protocols could no longer entirely conceal the horrifying reality of Louis's condition from those who served him most closely. Palace servants reported that the king's chambers had taken on a sickly sweet odor that seemed to permeate the very stones of Versailles, despite the constant burning of expensive incense and the application of exotic perfumes imported from across the French Empire. His legendary wigs, once symbols of royal magnificence, now served the practical purpose of concealing hair loss so extensive that courtiers whispered he had become completely bald, his scalp covered with sores that refused to heal despite the ministrations of Europe's most skilled physicians. The king's sleeping patterns had become so erratic that the traditional lever and cowsher ceremonies were frequently cancelled or delayed, leaving courtiers waiting for hours in antechambers while Louis experienced what his doctors euphemistically described as periods of royal meditation. Contemporary accounts suggest these episodes were actually extended periods of delirium, during which the king would ramble incoherently about long-dead courtiers, conduct conversations with invisible advisors, or deliver passionate speeches to empty rooms about the divine nature of his authority. When lucid, Louis seemed tormented by the growing awareness of his physical decay, alternating between desperate attempts to maintain his royal dignity and explosive rages directed at anyone who dared acknowledge his declining condition. The elaborate medical treatments prescribed for the Sun King represented a grotesque parody of the cutting-edge healing arts, as Europe's most renowned physicians competed to devise increasingly exotic remedies for conditions they dared not diagnose honestly. Louis was subjected to daily bloodletting using leeches imported from the furthest corners of the French Empire, purging with violent laxatives that left him weakened and dehydrated, and the application of bizarre poultices containing everything from powdered unicorn horn to mercury compounds that only accelerated his systemic poisoning. More experimental treatments included immersion in baths filled with wine and herbs, the consumption of preparations made from gold and precious stones, and even attempts at early forms of electrical therapy using devices that generated painful shocks through the king's already tortured body. As Louis's condition deteriorated further throughout 1714, his behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing in ways that revealed the complete breakdown of whatever psychological barriers had once contained his megalomaniacal tendencies. The king began issuing increasingly bizarre royal decrees that reflected his disconnection from reality, including orders that all mirrors in France be covered during periods when he felt his appearance was particularly disturbing, and commands that court artists create portraits showing him in his former glory rather than his current state. Most unsettling of all were his growing obsessions with death and decay, leading to long philosophical discussions with his confessor about the theological implications of divine rulers experiencing mortal corruption. The year 1715 brought the final phase of Louis's transformation from Sun King to decomposing corpse, though the elaborate machinery of royal protocol ensured that this process unfolded behind carefully maintained veils of secrecy and misdirection. Court physicians recorded symptoms that suggested advanced gangrene in his legs, with black patches of necrotic tissue spreading upward from his feet despite increasingly desperate surgical interventions. The smell emanating from these infected wounds became so overwhelming that special chambers had to be prepared where the king could be attended without subjecting courtiers to the full horror of his condition. Though even these precautions proved insufficient as the stench began permeating entire wings of Versailles. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Louis's apparent awareness of his own decay, combined with his absolute refusal to acknowledge the reality of his mortality in any way that might compromise his divine status. Contemporary accounts describe the king examining his gangrenous legs with clinical detachment, discussing the progression of the infection as if it were happening to someone else entirely, while simultaneously maintaining his insistence on participating in court ceremonies that required him to stand for hours on limbs that were literally rotting away. This psychological dissociation created a grotesque spectacle that traumatized even hardened court physicians as they were forced to watch their king slowly decompose while maintaining elaborate pretenses that nothing was amiss. The final weeks of Louis's life were marked by a series of medical crises that tested the limits of court protocol and human endurance, as the Sun King's body began failing in ways that made concealment increasingly impossible. His legendary appetite had transformed into complete inability to keep food down, leading to violent vomiting episodes that left him weakened and further dehydrated, while courtiers pretended not to notice the king regurgitating meals that had cost more than most French citizens earned in a year. The gangrene in his legs had progressed to the point where bone was visible through the necrotic tissue, yet Louis continued to insist on participating in daily court ceremonies that required him to walk distances his decomposing limbs could no longer manage without excruciating pain. Court records from this period reveal a king caught between his absolute belief in his own divine immortality and the increasingly undeniable evidence of his physical corruption, creating psychological tensions that manifested in behavior so bizarre that even his most devoted courtiers began to question their sovereign's sanity. Louis would spend hours staring at his reflection in the Hall of Mirrors, apparently trying to reconcile the magnificent image he maintained in his mind with the grotesque reality that stared back at him from countless reflective surfaces. During these episodes, servants reported hearing him carry on conversations with his younger self, pleading with the image of the handsome young king to return and restore his former glory. The elaborate medical procedures inflicted on Louis during his final days represented the intersection of royal protocol with primitive medical understanding, creating a perfect storm of suffering that would have challenged even modern pain management techniques. His physicians, desperate to show progress in treating their divine patient, resorted to increasingly invasive surgeries that attempted to remove the gangrenous tissue from his legs, using crude instruments and techniques that belonged more in a torture chamber than a medical facility. These operations, performed without anesthesia beyond liberal applications of alcohol and opium, left Louis screaming in agony, while courtiers maintained the fiction that their king was receiving the finest medical care available to European royalty. Even as his body systematically failed, Louis maintained his insistence on conducting state business, leading to increasingly surreal cabinet meetings where ministers were forced to discuss matters of national importance while their king lay propped up in bed, his legs wrapped in bandages that could not entirely contain the smell of rotting flesh. Foreign ambassadors, who had once competed for audiences with the Sun King, now found themselves subjected to diplomatic meetings that resembled medical consultations more than affairs of state, as Louis would frequently interrupt discussions of treaty negotiations to demand updates on his condition or to issue rambling monologues about the theological implications of divine rulers experiencing mortal decay. The psychological impact on the court of Versailles during Louis's final decomposition created a climate of barely controlled hysteria that threatened to tear apart the elaborate social fabric the Sun King had spent decades constructing. Courtiers who had devoted their lives to worshipping their sovereign's physical magnificence now found themselves trapped in daily proximity to his putrefying remains, forced to maintain expressions of reverent attention while battling waves of nausea and existential terror. Some nobles began experiencing what contemporary accounts describe as sympathetic symptoms, developing their own mysterious ailments and fixations that seemed to mirror aspects of the king's decline, as if royal corruption was somehow contagious within the confined atmosphere of the palace. The question of succession became increasingly urgent as Louis's condition deteriorated, yet the king's absolute refusal to acknowledge his mortality made any practical planning nearly impossible, creating a dangerous power vacuum that threatened to plunge France into civil war upon his death. His heir, the Dauphin, had died in 1711, leaving the succession to his great-grandson, a child of 5 who would become Louis XV, but the Sun King seemed incapable of accepting any arrangement that implied his own eventual death. Cabinet meetings devoted to succession planning would inevitably dissolve into chaos, as Louis would interrupt proceedings to deliver passionate speeches about his divine immortality, often while visibly decomposing before the horrified eyes of his ministers and advisors. As August 1715 progressed, even the most elaborate court protocols could no longer maintain the illusion that the Sun King remained a viable monarch. Yet the psychological and political machinery of absolute monarchy made any acknowledgement of this reality virtually impossible. The contradiction between royal ideology and biological fact created increasingly grotesque spectacles, such as formal court presentations where foreign dignitaries were introduced to a king whose legs were literally falling apart, or state dinners where Louis would attempt to eat while suffering from digestive problems so severe that he could barely swallow without vomiting. These events traumatized participants and observers alike, creating lasting psychological scars among those forced to witness the slow-motion collapse of the most powerful monarchy in Europe. The final days of August brought a series of medical crises that finally overwhelmed even Louis's legendary ability to deny reality, as his body began shutting down in ways that could not be concealed or explained away through royal protocol. The gangrene that had consumed his legs was now spreading upward toward his torso, creating a race between systemic organ failure and localized tissue death that his physicians were powerless to influence, despite their increasingly desperate interventions. Court records described the king alternating between periods of delirium where he would deliver passionate speeches about his eternal reign, and moments of terrifying clarity where he seemed to fully understand the horror of his condition without being able to accept its implications for his divine status. On August 25, 1715, Louis XIV experienced what court physicians recorded as his final coherent day, though contemporary accounts suggest this coherence was itself a form of madness that reflected the complete breakdown of his psychological defenses against mortality. The king spent his final hours of awareness conducting what he apparently believed would be a temporary audience with his great-grandson and heir, delivering detailed instructions for governing France during what he described as his brief absence from earthly duties. This conversation, witnessed by horrified courtiers, revealed a mind that had constructed an elaborate alternative reality where death was merely a temporary inconvenience that would not affect his eternal reign over France and its people. The Sun King's final struggle against mortality unfolded over the course of 4 agonizing days that tested the limits of court protocol and human endurance. As Louis's body systematically shut down, while his mind apparently refused to accept the reality of what was happening to him. Palace servants reported hearing him call out for long-dead courtiers and ministers, apparently trying to conduct governmental business with advisors who had been in their graves for decades, while simultaneously demanding that his current ministers explain why his body was betraying his divine will. The disconnect between his mental state and physical reality created a grotesque spectacle that traumatized even hardened palace officials who had witnessed decades of royal excess and cruelty. During his final night, August 31st, Louis experienced what physicians described as a series of convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed on his right side while apparently remaining conscious and aware of his condition, creating the horrifying situation where the Sun King could observe his own body's final failure without being able to control or prevent it. Court records indicate that his last coherent words were not prayers or expressions of love for his family, but angry demands that his ministers explain why France was allowing its king to die, as if his subjects' failure to maintain his immortality represented a form of treason against divine authority. This final assertion of absolute royal prerogative, delivered by a man whose body was literally decomposing as he spoke, represented the ultimate expression of the psychological derangement that absolute power had inflicted on one of history's most intelligent and capable monarchs. Louis XIV died at 8:15 in the morning of September 1st, 1715, bringing to an end the longest reign in European history and leaving behind a corpse so corrupted by disease and medical intervention that court physicians reportedly required several hours to determine the exact moment of death. The immediate aftermath revealed the extent to which the elaborate machinery of royal protocol had become dependent on denying biological reality, as ministers and courtiers found themselves psychologically unprepared to acknowledge that their divine sovereign could actually die like any common mortal. The elaborate procedures for managing royal succession, carefully developed over decades of absolute rule, proved inadequate when confronted with the reality of a king whose death had been literally unthinkable within the theological and political framework of French monarchy. The disposal of Louis's remains presented unique challenges that reflected both the advanced state of decomposition and the theological complexities surrounding the death of a supposedly divine ruler, creating logistical and spiritual problems that had no precedent in French royal protocol. Court physicians reported that the king's body had deteriorated so extensively that traditional embalming procedures proved inadequate, requiring the development of specialized techniques that could preserve remains that were already partially decomposed at the time of death. The process took several days and required the expertise of embalmers brought from across Europe, creating a macabre spectacle that contradicted every aspect of the magnificent royal image Louis had spent his lifetime constructing. Even in death, the Sun King's body continued to assert its disturbing presence over the court of Versailles, as the elaborate funeral preparations were repeatedly disrupted by the continuing decay of the royal corpse, despite the best efforts of Europe's most skilled morticians. Contemporary accounts describe a coffin that required special construction to contain both the king's considerable bulk and the additional materials needed to manage ongoing decomposition, while the lying in state had to be carefully managed to prevent courtiers and foreign dignitaries from being overwhelmed by odors that even elaborate applications of perfumes and incense could not entirely mask. The contrast between the magnificent funeral ceremonies and the grotesque reality they were designed to conceal created a final irony that seemed to embody the fundamental contradictions of absolute monarchy itself. The legacy of Louis XIV's horrifying final months extended far beyond the immediate trauma inflicted on those who witnessed his decline, fundamentally altering the psychological and political foundations of French monarchy in ways that would contribute to its eventual destruction during the Revolution of 1789. The courtiers who had spent decades worshipping their king's physical magnificence found themselves psychologically scarred by the experience of watching their god decompose before their eyes, creating a climate of cynicism and disillusionment that undermined the theological foundations of royal authority. Future French kings would struggle to maintain the divine mystique that Louis had perfected, as the memory of the Sun King's putrefying corpse served as a constant reminder of the mortal vulnerability that lurked beneath even the most elaborate royal ceremonies. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms recorded during Louis XIV's final illness suggests a combination of diabetes, heart disease, and advanced sepsis that would have challenged even contemporary medical treatment, but the primitive understanding and bizarre procedures inflicted on the Sun King undoubtedly accelerated his decline and intensified his suffering. The king, who had revolutionized European culture and established France as the dominant continental power, had become a victim of the same absolute authority that had made his achievements possible, as his divine status prevented anyone from providing the honest medical assessment and practical treatment that might have prolonged his life, or at least reduced his suffering during his final months. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how completely Louis's elaborate persona had become divorced from his biological reality, creating a form of psychological schizophrenia that made rational response to his medical crisis literally impossible within the confines of royal protocol. The Sun King, who had proclaimed himself the embodiment of French state authority, discovered that this identification had become so complete that acknowledging his physical mortality would have required dismantling the entire political and theological framework he had spent 72 years constructing. His gruesome death thus represented not just the failure of a human body, but the inevitable collision between absolute power and biological reality that exposes the fundamental absurdity of any political system based on the fiction of human divinity. The courtiers who survived Louis XIV's decomposition carried with them memories that would haunt French royal culture for generations, creating a hidden legacy of psychological trauma that influenced court behavior and political decision-making in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The experience of watching their supposedly immortal sovereign literally rot before their eyes, while maintaining the pretense that nothing was amiss, created a form of collective mental disorder that may have contributed to the increasingly erratic behavior of subsequent French monarchs, and the growing disconnect between royal fantasy and political reality that would eventually make revolution inevitable. In the end, the Sun King's transformation from divine ruler to decomposing corpse serves as perhaps history's most graphic illustration of the ultimate futility of absolute power when confronted with the basic biological facts of human existence. His 72-year reign had created the most elaborate royal persona in European history. Yet all the glory of Versailles and all the worship of his subjects could not prevent his body from following the same patterns of decay and death that claimed the humblest of his peasants. The man who had declared that he was the state discovered in his final agonizing months that no amount of political power could override the fundamental democracy of death, which reduces all human ambition to the same inevitable biological conclusion regardless of earthly rank or divine pretensions. Was Louis XIV simply a victim of primitive medical understanding and the tragic coincidence of multiple illnesses? Or did his absolute power create a form of psychological and physical corruption that literally rotted him from within? The disturbing parallels between his moral decay and his bodily decomposition suggest possibilities that challenge our comfortable assumptions about the relationship between political authority and human nature itself.